Hi there, it's Geoff here again with another video on economics. This time we're going to focus on how to use developed diagrams to get you to those top grades in your exams. Now, examiners want to see good use of diagrams to support both your analysis and your evaluation. I marked thousands of papers and scripts last year, and the quality of diagrams can have an insane effect on your grade. What we'd like to see is a developed diagram. And what do we mean by that? Well, it could mean shifting more than one curve. It could mean changing the elasticity of demand or supply, possibly. It could involve drawing a double diagram side by side to illustrate a more complex relationship. And it can certainly involve identifying areas of welfare loss or gain, perhaps from a particular intervention such as a tax or a subsidy. Now, what I have for you in this video is 5 examples of developed diagrams from 5 different parts of the course. So let me walk you through some examples of developed diagrams. First of all, supply and demand. Here's a chart showing olive oil production from 2012 through to 2024, and in particular focus on the last 2 years where there's been a steep fall, a big decline in total global olive oil production. Now, the diagram on the right hints at a possible explanation for this, a possible supply shock, where the supply curve shifts from S1 to S2. I've drawn the demand curve for olive oil as price inelastic, and the consequence is a big rise in the market price. And this diagram will be a good explanation of potential reason for the price change. Developing your diagram suggests shifting more than one curve. Perhaps, for example, there might be some speculative demand in the market. People expecting the price of olive oil to go up and therefore bringing forward purchases or adding to their stockpiles in anticipation of that price increase. So I've shifted the demand curve out to D2, which at the intersection with supply 2 gives a price level of P3. So here's a good example of a simple supply and demand diagram which is developed. More than one curve is shifted. An inward shift of supply due to, for example, the impact of drought or just generally poor weather conditions affecting the yield of olive oil, and then an outward shift of demand created by speculative investors. My second example is the minimum wage. So here's the classic minimum wage diagram, where you're asked to examine the possible effect on unemployment of a minimum wage. Free market wage is W1, and if you set a minimum wage higher than that, employment will fall, particularly if labour demand is found to be wage elastic. So minimum wage would cause a contraction in labour demand from E1 to E2. Now, this is a perfectly fine diagram showing the impact of a minimum wage, but changing the elasticity of demand can change the analysis. The impact of a minimum wage does depend on the wage elasticity of demand for labour. And in this situation, if labour demand is wage inelastic, let's compare the previous diagram with this one, then the impact on employment is much smaller, significantly smaller. So changing the elasticity can change your analysis and also change your evaluation. And develop the diagram further. Perhaps if labour demand is inelastic and people on low incomes get a boost to their effective real incomes, that could cause a rise in consumer spending for goods and services, and higher consumer spending, in theory, could shift out labour demand to LD2. So you might end up with even higher employment than you had before. So this diagram shows 2 things. First of all, a change in the elasticity of demand. And secondly, a developed diagram shifting the demand curve outwards. My third example is currency depreciation using ADAS analysis. Now, when a currency depreciates, typically it provides a lift or a boost to exports because a weaker pound or weaker dollar makes exports priced in those currencies cheaper in global markets. And this diagram shows the impact on aggregate demand of a rise in exports from AD1, if you like, to AD2. Now, that leads to an increase in real national output and a potential rise in the price level. You could develop the diagram by shifting it out further and saying there's an export multiplier effect. So you could develop the diagram here by shifting AD out to AD3, for example. However, I've decided to think about the impact of currency depreciation on import costs. You see, a fall in the pound makes the things that we import From crude oil to steel to copper to fertilizers used in farming, a weaker pound makes those imports more expensive when converted into sterling. And higher imports causes an increase in cost for businesses, shifting aggregate supply to the left, causing a diminution or a fall in real national output and a further rise in cost plus inflation. So here's a good example of a developed diagram where you might argue that a currency depreciation causes two shifts in the curve, an increase in AD, but also a fall in short-run aggregate supply. And this is a good example of a developed diagram. Don't forget also to put in the long-run aggregate supply curve if you're using this classical model, because you need to know where the economy is relative to its potential output. Now, these kind of diagrams have a big effect on A-level grades. This clear, developed diagram, fully labelled, would score very well in your paper. My fourth example is the Laffer curve. Now, lots of students like to use the Laffer curve in their analysis. It's the idea that there's a non-linear relationship between the tax rate on the x-axis here and the total tax the government gets coming into the government. Initially, increasing the overall burden of tax from T1 to T2 leads to an increase in total tax revenues. But under certain circumstances, lifting the tax rate from T3 to T4 might lead to a fall in total tax, whereas tax rate T3 as a percentage might be considered optimal if the objective is to achieve the maximum tax revenues. The optimal rate of tax, of course, will vary from country to country, and finding it is difficult. So there's your standard Laffer curve, if you like. However, you can develop the diagram. So, for example, in the UK, the government has decided to freeze income tax allowances. You can earn £12,570 per year before you start paying income tax at 20%. But that rate has been frozen for several years and will continue to be frozen until 2029. So although the tax percentage hasn't changed, the amount the government is getting in tax has gone up significantly, because with inflation and pay rises, people are now moving into higher tax brackets. Instead of paying tax at 20%, for example, they might be paying a share of their income at 40%. And the effect of fiscal drag is to shift the Laffer curve upwards. The government gets more tax for each percentage tax rate. Or the government could bring in effective, tough tax avoidance measures. Tax avoidance is where you find legal loopholes, tax reliefs and allowances and so on and so forth, in an attempt to reduce your tax liability. Well, in this situation, if tax avoidance is successful, again, the government could increase tax revenue without changing the tax rate. So this is a good example of how to use a developed Laffer curve diagram in a question on fiscal policy. And my final example looks at welfare losses from externalities. Common question concerns the welfare effect of negative externalities from production. And here's a perfectly good diagram that students might draw. The output Q1 only considers private costs and benefits. It's the intersection of MPC and MPB. But if we ignore the externalities, output is too high for a social optimum. We prefer to be at Q2, where marginal social cost meets marginal social benefit. And hence there's an overproduction here, a market failure, if the market only prices in the private costs and benefits. Now that's fine, it's a good diagram. The diagram also shows the marginal external cost at output Q1. But many students don't include the welfare loss. So it's important to develop your diagram, label the areas A, B and C, label it, annotate. The deadweight welfare loss arising from overproduction is the triangle A, B, C. So there's your diagram without the welfare loss. There's the same diagram but with the welfare loss clearly identified and labelled. And this is what examiners want to see. There we go, 5 examples of developing your diagrams to help you get those top grades in economics. Thanks for joining in, take care and see you soon.